Today is November 5th. It is officially the 36th day of the current federal government shutdown, marking it the longest government shutdown in US history. And I think a lot of people know what happens at the federal level when the government shuts down. Non-essential workers are furloughed without pay. Essential workers, like those that work at TSA or FEMA, are continued to be called into work, but are also working without pay. But I think people are less aware, though, starting to become and learn about how the federal shutdown impacts state and local governments. So if you could just talk about, how does the federal government shutdown impact kind of the flow of funds that state and local governments depend on for essential services like transportation, emergency management, education? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it depends on the numbers that you use. Somewhere around a third of state government budgets are connected in some way to federal money. And I think we're starting to see exactly how that flow of funds affects the way that states do what they do, and also affects, in many ways, the way that the federal government intends for those programs to work at the state and local level, and what happens when the dollars aren't there to make those programs work the way that they're supposed to work at the state and local level. I think what we're seeing recently, especially in some of the really kind of immediate impacts and some of the more visible impacts in areas like SNAP and WIC, and there's some states have decided to essentially front the money to keep those programs working. Some are prepared to do that, some are less prepared to do that. That's a very obvious and very visible sort of example. I think what we are starting to see now that we haven't necessarily seen in past shutdowns, just because this one has gone on as long as it has, is what we might call the kind of administrative strain that's going on in the background. So much of that one third of state and local budgets that's connected to federal money in some ways is reimbursements, right? You have to, as a state or a big city, usually spend money and get reimbursed, or at least front some share of the dollars to access whatever that is, federal highway dollars, transit, again, SNAP benefits, Head Start, you name it, all those different federal programs that in many ways are reimbursing for expenses that have been incurred. If you're a state or a local government and you're asking if we make those payments, if we are in touch with our partners in the federal government as a normal course of business, that works out really well. But now those calls aren't being returned, and now those reimbursements are piling up and going, unaddressed. And so at some point you have to ask the question, do we as a state or a city either halt operations or at least roll back operations if we can't find some state or local dollars to backfill? And that's where I think the next kind of wave of this is going. And it'll be in, again, some very visible areas that we don't typically associate with federal money, but that are closely connected to federal money, that we'll see services come to a halt, or at least become much more difficult to access a lot of these key services that have existed as part of a state and local partnership for a long time.
Can you give me an example of some of the services that you're talking about that are going to start feeling this administrative backlog?
Yeah, so one example would be federal highways, where the federal government is covering typically 80% of the costs of those big projects, but it's up to state and local governments, typically states, to cover that 20%. And a lot of that 20% is upfront. It's design costs, site preparation, those sorts of costs that you have to incur before the project is even really up and running. And sequencing that work takes a long time, sometimes months or years in advance, to line up, all of the different bids that need to be put in place, identifying the contractors that can do the work. If you see a delay in the approval of any of that kind of project planning process, it ripples through the entire project, throws off the entire timeline, takes longer, and ultimately costs a lot more for those kinds of things to happen. And so soon, and to a degree even already, we're starting to see that kind of a delay ripple through a lot of big state highway projects, for instance. There's an analogous thing that happens in transit, and we're starting to see that as well with certain Federal Transit Authority, grants, especially for capital projects. A lot of that is, the grantee fronts a lot of the costs. You see amendments and things that are more difficult to do later on if you have to change the time frame. And at the moment, if you just can't get your questions answered, because there's nobody at the Federal Department of Transportation and the FTA in particular answering the phones, then you as a city transit agency or regional transit authority have to really rethink how and when you're going to allow big projects like that to unfold. So even just a few week delay causes that administrative backlog that can make things, just again, more complex, more time consuming and more expensive. And that's in the more sort of capital intensive side of things. When you think about what goes on in education, for instance, a lot of the federal grants that go to the states and to big cities, a lot of that's forward funded. Big administrative backlogs will, again, force a lot of those programs to either be slowed down, maybe scaled back if you can't find some sort of local backfill. And then something that is especially important, you would think after the pandemic, is a lot of the public health work. So much of what the CDC used to do was done through all sorts of cooperative agreements with local public health departments, with universities. A lot of those, again, were reimbursable sorts of expenses. And this is in critical areas, epidemiology, surveillance, all those things that can help us to know if and when the next kind of pandemic might happen. When you see a slowdown or even a halting of that kind of data being collected and that sort of analysis being done and that sort of surveillance information being distributed out to localities, it just makes us a lot more vulnerable for some sort of a major public health event. So it's those kinds of core capital projects and services that are starting now to be affected, going beyond the much more visible and immediate things like SNAP benefits and air traffic controllers and some of the things we've talked about so far.
Yeah. So I have so many follow-up questions for that because I mean, education just doesn't stop. Kids don't stop going to school. People don't stop driving on highways. Illness doesn't stop. Same thing with natural disasters. I mean, we've seen what's going on in Alaska with the tsunami and the floods. I'm curious what happens in terms of management and operations when they can no longer rely on that support or funding. You're talking about halting or pausing some of these projects. I'm curious if this shutdown, regardless of how much longer it lasts, I'm curious if it's going to impact the way state and local governments kind of think about the relationship that they have with the federal government and their partners and these partner agencies if they can't rely on them.
That is exactly correct. And certainly when I think about the longer term impact of this, we can talk about the administrative backlogs and the cash flow problems and all of that being the kind of near term legacy of this shutdown. But the long term legacy is, I think, exactly as you said. It's forcing a lot of states and localities to really fundamentally rethink their partnership with the federal government. This has been going on for a long time now. I mean, when you look at a statistic that I always like to point out is that in 1950, the federal government had responsibility for 50% of the major infrastructure in the United States. By today, or at least as of a year or two ago, that share had shifted to basically 75% state and local and 25% federal. The federal government, at least on big infrastructure projects, is mostly limited now to federal highways, transit projects, some big, ports and other economic development kinds of projects. But a lot of the kind of bread and butter infrastructure that we think about, roads, bridges, sidewalks, stormwater management, water, sewer, is mostly local now. And that's the result of a long, slow shifting in the responsibility for infrastructure in the United States. And so in many ways, what we're seeing here is the kind of the conclusion of that trend, right? The final stage where the handful of things that the federal government is still very involved in are being reconsidered. And in many cases, it's pretty clear that the federal government intends to get out of some of those lines of business. Big urban transit projects, as one example, in Chicago, just a few weeks ago, we saw roughly $2 billion of federal money for a major extension to the Chicago Transit Authority trains pulled back. It's fair to say that money will probably come back at some point, but it does raise the question of, can you count on that kind of federal support for those sorts of projects in the future? So that shift in the federal state partnership has been ongoing for a long time. This, I think, has accelerated it, and it's exposed some of the real flaws and weaknesses in that relationship. As state and local folks, you can lament that and wish for the good old days, or you can do what many of them are doing, which is adapting, which is, just as you were saying, finding new ways to manage these programs, redefine what is really essential. We're seeing a lot of emphasis at the state and local level now on things like improving the effectiveness of our cash management strategies, improving the effectiveness of how we make budgets, improving the effectiveness of our debt management function, how we go out and borrow money and most effectively time when we borrow money so that we can have the lowest possible interest rates and do the best job that we can of investing those dollars. There's a lot of mileage that states and localities can get out of the dollars that they have, and they're really leaning into that now, simply because I think there's an understanding that the federal government support is just not going to be there. And the trade-off for that is, potentially there's some real advantages for states with that. There's less strings attached to those dollars, a lot more local autonomy, maybe getting out of some of the funding requirements that the federal government places on them. Like you can see a world where there could be some benefits to that, but we are very much here and now in the immediate adjustment phase, which is the really painful one, trying to figure out what to do, not just about the shutdown and the immediate effects of it, but forcing you to rethink what that means for our, 3, 5, 10-year relationship with the federal government.
Yeah, and I can also imagine that it's going to cause a really big disparity in terms of states and show the states that have those resources to support and kind of fill the gap that the federal government is lacking. Like states like California, Texas, New York that have, wide resources in terms of their budget, their infrastructure, tax dollars and population and stuff that has been built in versus states like maybe Arkansas, Mississippi, states that have, lower population, more rural, less resources are probably, we're dependent on a donor state. I feel like that's going to really highlight the gaps in terms of the support that they need to be able to complete some of these projects, to support public services, to support social services. I want to go back to what you said about the administrative backlog. What do states do to prepare like contingency plans when the federal government shuts down?
Yeah, it really varies place by place. There are some that, especially given that this is the third or fourth shutdown we've experienced now over the last whatever it is, 15 years, there are states that have formal contingency funds and plans in place so that they can do things like front load some of the spending that needs to happen to keep, say, your SNAP program running or some other bigger projects from being completely stalled out. So those immediate stopgap resources are there in many states, and in many cases they have contingency plans that call for things like shifting some dollars from one grant program to another, or finding ways to backlog or sorry to backfill some of the federal grant dollars, for instance, with general fund or other dollars that states have that they can move around a little bit. So most places have some sort of a formal plan that allows them to do that for some period of time to try to minimize the disruptions. You've also seen in many states declarations of emergencies. A lot of the SNAP funding that's been activated at the state level has been by declaring a food emergency or declaring some sort of other natural disaster. And the FEMA piece of this, which we haven't talked about at all, is another really important one where you have certain types of formal contingency plans in place for disasters. That's the business that they're in, so they know to expect the unexpected. And you're seeing that same kind of thought process now permeate throughout state governments. Right now, at the same time, all of those contingency plans are based on the idea of a 30-day federal government shutdown as the kind of absolute longest, because historically that would have been the longest that we had seen. We're now at the longest we've ever experienced, and no end in sight, at least as of today. That's where this gets tricky because there's no contingency plans for a several month long federal government shutdown. And there's also at the same time no plans for in many places to begin to unwind that federal partnership anytime in the next 6 months or a year or 2 years. So we're now in this gray area between near-term contingency, near-term disaster response, and a longer-term strategic planning and longer-term changes in how we think about that partnership. How are states going to navigate that? That's every place is in a very different moment when it comes to that, and we're seeing all kinds of variation in the way that they're responding.
Yeah, it seems like states are treading water, and there's only so long that we can go without having some type of buoy or life support to be able to keep our head above it. I mean, you mentioned FEMA and essential services. The FEMA workers, the ones that are sent to natural disaster zones for debris cleanup, for rescue, to manage emergency operations, to set up temporary shelters. those are also workers that are not getting paid. TSA employees who have to go to work every day and manage the security of our airports. They're still not getting paid, but they still have bills. They're still humans living in our society that need to be able to take care of themselves. Um, I want to go back to the administrative backlog too, in terms of IT and data. Most state and local governments, they operate a lot of legacy systems and at the federal level as well. What does the backlog do to some of these management and operating systems? Does it put a strain on them?
Yeah, that IT in particular is an area that's where that strain is even more pronounced, right? I mean, the old the old saying is that one of the problems with government procurement of IT systems is that by the time you finish the process, the system is now obsolete. So that the desire to get those processes done quickly is even stronger in that space. And so any delay you feel even more than you do for other types of procurements for other types of projects. And so yeah, that is a big concern, and there was quite a bit of federal money that was connected to that coming out of the sorry coming out of the Biden relief plans, the pandemic relief plans. There was a lot of state spending for upgrades to IT systems. The pandemic really exposed just how vulnerable a lot of the systems were, and really you saw this big surge in demand for people to be able to access services online and participate in public hearings online. And so states and localities realized that their systems were really not up to the task in many cases. So we've seen a lot of investment, or at least the beginnings of a lot of investment in those types of systems. These sorts of delays will only make that much more difficult. And again, it's not like building a road or a bridge where you can say, well, if it becomes more expensive, there's some design things that we might be able to do to try to trim those costs. There might be things we can do to make sure that we still accomplish the basic goal that this piece of infrastructure is meant to accomplish with fewer dollars. With IT systems, you may not have that option. Like we may have moved on to the next iteration of whatever that system is by the time you're ready to pay for it and install it. So it's a huge challenge. And again, I think an area where some states are prepared to throw some more local or state dollars into that mix to continue to move those procurements and move those projects forward. Many are not. And to the point that you made then about disparities, that's a lot of the federal money, particularly in IT, was really intended to alleviate those disparities, right? It was in recognition of the enormous variation in the capacity that exists across the states. There was dollars calibrated specifically to be invested in places where the need was greatest. So you remove the federal government from that landscape, and everyone is left to their on their own to do this with their own capacity. Those disparities become even more pronounced. And then it's worth noting that then trickles down to the local level, because within states you have the same sorts of horizontal disparities. Many state programs are designed exactly to address those sorts of disparities in the capacity that local governments have. And if the states have to pull back because the federal government has pulled back, it amplifies a lot of those local disparities. So the knock-on effects of this are really important.
Mhm. And I want to keep going with the kind of like the trickle down effects of rolling this administrative burden down the hill. What other vulnerabilities do state and local governments open themselves up to when they cannot manage or upgrade their IT systems properly without the federal dollars? I'm speaking specifically about maybe cybersecurity vulnerabilities that state and local governments open themselves up to when they don't have the federal dollars to manage these systems properly.
Yeah, some of it is just mundane day-to-day things, being able to have systems that work well and that claims can be processed and that personal data can be handled appropriately and all of that sort of thing that goes on within state Medicaid programs, within the SNAP programs, within licensing and permitting systems, all of which now exist online and all of which people expect to work. Just for better or for worse, the standard is Amazon, right? People expect that kind of user experience now. And if your systems aren't in place, it just does a lot to really harm trust in government, really perpetuate the myth that government can't get anything right, even though there's a lot of really good people working behind the scenes to make these systems work as well as they can, despite the limited IT capacity they might have. So that's just some of it is just the user experience and just the quality of the service that we can provide. But the cyber risks are especially pronounced. There have been some very high profile cyber issues over the last several weeks and months, especially at the local level. Of course, a lot of them you don't hear about because a ransom is paid or it's kept out of the press or whatever it might be. But there have been some which are really arguably cyber incidents where a better, more secure system would have probably prevented. A lot of cyber incidents, of course, are the result of human error, the result of somebody allowing a virus in or something along those lines. But there have been some instances where old systems have been vulnerable to specific kinds of hacks in a way that newer, more secure systems are not vulnerable. And so it really does. It exposes sensitive information. These are very expensive to deal with. You used to be able to get cyber insurance. That's very hard to come by these days. So there are unique, administrative and other sorts of burdens that we have to deal with when we have outmoded IT systems, as is the case for many states and localities.
Hmm. As we're coming up on time, I want to talk about the what the future looks like in terms of the not only state and local government reliance on federal funding, but we talk about, you just mentioned that this shutdown, especially when it halts or pauses or disrupts a lot of the essential services or even just services that people rely on to continue their daily lives, it erodes that kind of trust in state and local governments. What is this doing in terms of eroding the trust between state and local governments and the federal government, especially as more of the burden for these services and for these infrastructure projects, housing, education, public health, are being put on states, in terms of what they can expect from the federal government if they continue on this road of placing the burden more on states and then not being able to kind of hold up even their smaller end of the bargain?
In many ways, it's a case of be careful what you wish for, because there's a lot of state and local leaders have been saying for a long time that it would be great if the federal government was less in our business. It would be great if we had more autonomy. And I think when state and local leaders would say that, typically they were not referring to programs like SNAP and Medicaid and a lot of the areas where the federal pullback is now well underway. They would typically mean it in areas like transportation, environmental regulation, those sorts of things. And I think what we're realizing from all of this is that the financial relationships between the federal government and state and local governments, setting aside the regulatory and other sorts of relationships, but just the financial interdependencies between these levels of government are in areas where there are vulnerable populations, where there are very visible populations, where there's really sort of bipartisan consensus, for lack of a better word, on why we're providing things like SNAP benefits and those sorts of assistance in the first place. And so this has, I think, really forced that question of, you say you want less federal government involvement. This is what less federal government involvement looks like, at least in terms of the dollars that can be pulled back immediately. So it'll be interesting to see what a lot of state and local leaders, if they rethink that philosophy, or if they maybe more finely tune that philosophy to say, well, we didn't mean that kind of federal pullback. We didn't mean that kind of autonomy. We meant this kind of autonomy. But it definitely does, it definitely begs the larger question of what that partnership looks like going forward. I think that for certainly the advice that I've given a lot of state and local leaders, especially in some of these more capital intensive endeavors like big transit projects, big highway projects, is that some of this is a function of the political climate that we're in, but a lot of it really is a function of just the federal government's overall financial position. And there's whether it is the result of the current president and the current administration's priorities with respect to how it wants to support states and localities, or how it does not want to support states and localities. The reality of the federal government having close to now $40 trillion in debt, having to really carefully rethink its own priorities, scale back spending in a lot of areas. This is really, in many ways, just the beginning of this. So I think as difficult as it is, there is an opportunity here for states and localities to really think, what are the highest priority areas where we can depend on the federal government? Where can we not depend on it? If we are able to provide a lot of these services through state and local dollars, then let's do that. Otherwise, let's recognize that this is a real limitation going forward, that the world has changed. We need to change with it. I think smart, entrepreneurial, forward-looking state and local leaders will lead that, and will probably in many ways come out even better as a result of it. But it's definitely a wrenching and really challenging moment that we're in at the moment.
Hmm. My last question for you, and I'm sure you don't have an answer for this, but I have to ask anyway because of your expertise. How much longer do you think the federal shutdown is going to last?
Yeah, really hard to say. I certainly am not a political prognosticator. The point of reference that certainly we bring to this is a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. You know, when you hear about conversations, like regular communication that would otherwise happen between people in state treasurers' offices and their counterparts at the federal treasury around basic payments, remitting arbitrage payments on municipal bonds. I mean, all sorts of things like that that are just normal course of business. When that breaks down, and when those things are just simply not happening, and all of that then flows up into the political leadership within the states, which then flows up to the congressional leadership. Certainly, there's reason to think that there's enough happening now deep in the bureaucracy, and there's enough feedback making its way up from deep in the bureaucracy that congressional leaders and certainly state level leaders are now very, very aware of everything that we've talked about, the knock-on effects of this. One would think that that would create a little bit more pressure, and the longer this goes on, you can think of that as kind of an exponential effect. It's not a linear thing, but an exponential effect that would lead you to believe that we're probably close to the end of this. And yet, nobody thought we would get this far in the first place. So it's really, really, really hard to say. What I can say is certainly every state and local leader who I talk to is excited to get back to the normal course of business. They're excited to, uh, you know, mitigate the human toll that a lot of this is taking, get to work on dealing with the administrative and cash flow toll that it has taken and will continue to take even after it's been resolved. That can't come soon enough.